Now, it's interesting. I was thinking on this all week long as I was studying through this and thinking about it. Why would he, in all of the epistles that he writes to the churches, why would he say grace and peace but say nothing about mercy? And why then, when he writes to these men, would he say grace, mercy, and peace? And maybe, I'm overthinking it and making too big a deal about it, but I think that there has to be a specific reason why he would include mercy here when he doesn't include it in the other books. Now, we understand from previous studies, if you've been part of this assembly for any length of time, that when he says grace and peace, that you should not understand that as just some formula greeting that Paul uses in all his epistles, but that there is a significant reason for that in relationship to what God is doing today in the world. When the world was ripe for the wrath of God according to prophecy, did God hold back His wrath? Yes. He stayed His wrath, He held back His wrath in favor of ushering in a day of grace and what? And peace. Now, this mercy thing, it seems to me, if you read the commentaries, they offer no insight into this change. However, when one considers who Paul is addressing in these books and the nature of their ministry as leading local churches, perhaps Paul is stressing that mercy is particularly in order when overseeing a local church. Okay? And I think that if you think about everything that the elders of a church do, not only in the teaching of the Word of God, but also in instructing the saints and so forth, I think there does have to be a fair amount of mercy, not only grace and peace, but also mercy involved in doing that. So that's really the only insight I can give you into that. Go back to Titus chapter 1. Something to note. All right, now, when we get to verse 5, in verse 5, we start getting into the heart issue, the meat of the issue of why Paul is writing to Titus. Okay? Verses 1 through 4 are, in large part, introduction. They're certainly not insignificant or inconsequential, because there's a lot of stuff there, as you know. But he says in verse 5, "For this cause left I thee in Crete, that," the purpose and the intent, "that thou shouldest set in order the things that are wanting, and ordain elders in every city as I had appointed thee." Now, there are a lot of things here in verse 5 that we need to discuss. The first thing I want to do is discuss the first phrase. Now, notice what it says. It says, "For this cause left I thee in Crete." Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that Paul had to have been present with Titus on Crete, right? They had to have been there together, or else it wouldn't make any sense for him to say, "I left you there." So the two men, Paul and Titus, had to have been together at some point on the island of Crete, laboring in word and doctrine and so on. And for some reason, Paul had to leave. And when he leaves, who does he leave behind? He leaves Titus. Okay? I mean, that's the only way that you can understand that expression. "For this cause I left thee" where? Well, if I leave my wife at the store to shop while I go somewhere else to get gas or whatever, I had to be with her in order to do what? Leave her there. Okay? You understand just the understanding of the language here. Now, come with me to Acts chapter 2. Come with me to Acts chapter 2. There's the big debate about how these churches at Crete got started. And I touched on this briefly when we had our introduction to the book of Titus a few weeks ago. Titus chapter 2, Acts chapter 2, my bad, I'm sorry, Acts chapter 2. Present on the day of Pentecost were Jewish believers and proselytes from the island of Crete. Okay? Look at what it says here. Verse 8. "How hear we every man in our own tongue wherein we were born, Parthians and Medes, Elamites, and dwellers in Mesopotamia, and in Judea, and in Cappadocia, and Pontus and Asia." Verse 10, "Phrygia and Pamphylia, and Egypt, and parts of Libya, about Cyrene, strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes." Verse 11, "Cretes." Well, where is Titus at when Paul writes him? For this cause left I thee where? In Crete. Okay? So, my understanding of the verses is that who is responsible for ordaining, establishing, and organizing the local churches on the island of Crete? Paul and Titus, or people that were at Pentecost and went back to Crete? It seems to me that it's who? Paul and Titus. Now, you should remember also in the book of Acts that Paul was in Crete, go to Acts 27, for a short time on his journey from Jerusalem to Rome when he was arrested and turned over to the Roman authorities. Acts chapter 27. There's a specific port called Fair Havens that is in or near the island of Crete. Acts chapter 27, verse 7. Notice. And when he had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Sindus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under where? Crete. Now, we could go on with this, but we're not going to. My point is just to show you, is Paul aware of Crete? Is he there for a time on his way to house arrest in Rome? The answer to that question is what? Yes. Okay? When he's there on this trip, is he at liberty to go out and preach the gospel to the Cretans and establish churches? No. There are 2 Roman guards there with him the whole time, escorting him back to his imprisonment in Rome. Okay? So when you see, come back with me to Titus chapter 1, when you read this about Paul leaving Titus there, implying that the 2 men had been there together for a time, the only place that this can fit is that Paul goes back to Crete after he is released from prison the first time. And he takes who with him? Titus. So he says, for this cause left I thee in Crete. Okay? So as I said to you, it appears unlikely that Paul would have been at liberty to establish churches on Crete when he was there on his way to Rome at the end of Acts. It appears that Paul and Titus went to Crete together after he was released from prison the first time, and this would account for Paul having left Titus where? On Crete. Okay, to finish and to complete the work that the 2 men started together. Now let's read on in the verse. Verse 5. For this cause. Now, I should say this to you. Does that tell you the reason why Paul is writing him? For this cause left I thee in Crete. Well, what's the cause? That, what's the next word after that? I'm being a little cryptic, I don't mean to be. Look at verse 5. For this cause left I thee in Crete. What's the next word? That. So is Paul going to tell us what the purpose and the intent, or why he left Titus at Crete? Well, why did he do it? That thou, that's Titus, should have set in order the things that are what? Wanting. Now we need to look at this for a minute. This phrase tells us, as I just said to you, why Paul left Titus on Crete. Okay? Come with me, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, when he says set things in order, what does that imply about the situation on Crete? It implies that Crete was in disorder, right? Because if things were functioning orderly, why would he tell them that he needed to set in order the things that are wanting? Okay? So it tells you that, number one, there is a situation of some disorder on Crete that Paul wants addressed, and he wants it fixed. Now that phrase, set in order, look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Look at verse 34. He says, and if any man hunger, let him eat at home, that ye come not together unto condemnation. Notice what it says at the end of the verse. And the rest will I do what? Set in order when I what? So were there some things in Corinth that needed Paul's direct attention? Yeah, because he says he's what? I'm coming down there. And when I come down there to Corinth, there's some stuff here that I'm going to do what? I'm going to set it in order. I'm going to straighten it out. I'm going to bring order to your disorder, he's saying here.